It may not have leapt out at you as one which needs looking at, but let me try and explain. There are probably two related questions within this, and it is particularly, I think, a lively thing in contemporary culture. One is a question of kind of race and colonialism bound up with Christianity, and also questions around the kind of diversity, what some people might describe as a diversity agenda in contemporary society, or a movement is maybe a more positive way of putting it, of celebrating diversity in our contemporary culture, and the sense that Christianity is a bit backward in that regard, right? So those two kind of things, race and colonialism, and then the role of diversity in contemporary culture and how Christianity, and essentially doesn't Christianity kind of just crush all that? It's not really interested, it's a bit repressive, it's a bit backwards. Now, we are on the edge of Bath, which is famously and unusually for a city pretty much monolithically white, but we are in a culture which is increasingly diverse, and many of us will have friends, family in Bristol and London, all sorts of other places which are far more diverse, and these might be quite live issues for some of our networks. And that is why I think it's important to think about it, because in some people's mind there is a narrative that Christianity is a Western, white man's religion which is responsible for oppression around the world, and it is therefore antithetical to the much more enlightened view that diversity of ethnicity, gender, sexuality is a good to be celebrated. Get rid of traditional religion and we get greater diversity. Christianity wants conformity and uniformity, mostly to the ideals of 1950s white men, or so it might be suggested. And so let's get rid of Christianity. How can you be a Christian in today's world? Now, that might not come out in a neatly formed question from your friend, but it's likely to be expressed in some sort of vague suggestion that Christianity is kind of repressive and backwards, it's a bit icky in its values for contemporary society. It's generally anti-progressive, anti-diversity, inadvertently white privileged, right? I don't know if you pick that kind of vibe up from people. You can actually detect it, I think, in the way that vicars are often portrayed in the media. Mainly, vicars in the media are kind of hapless, older men, white, a bit outdated, or sometimes genuinely sinister. That's kind of how we're presented. What do we say to all of this? I think there are a few things we can say. One is to acknowledge the ways in which this has been true. Some of the colonialism of the British Empire was so tightly bound to the veneer of Christian mission that civilizing the savages as natives was the Christian thing to do. And that is not good. And it did not treat people who were made in the image of God as image bearers. It did not treat them as they should have been treated. It was a cultural arrogance which is still seen today in some of the Church of England's attitudes, perhaps towards the global Anglican Communion. We have been, and in some cases still are, guilty of wrapping our faith up in white Western privilege and failing to see the difference. I think it is important to just kind of acknowledge that. If people are challenging us on that, I think it's reasonable to be challenged. Second, those errors, though errors, are human and not divine. And what I mean by that is that this privileging of kind of white Western views is not inherently Christian. Christianity is not the white man's religion. The average Christian in the world is a young black African woman. That is the most common Christian that exists in our globe. It is, in fact, Christianity is the most diverse movement in history. It has spread further across the globe than any other world religion. It is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural movement. It began in an obscure town in the Middle East, was founded by a gaggle of nobodies, was resting on the testimony of women. It was a persecuted minority movement until Constantine made it the religion of the Roman Empire. It started small and diverse, and it is currently the most diverse religion and movement in the world. And crucially, its vision for life and eternity is one of absolute diversity. So Revelation chapter 7 and verse 9 says, as the vision of what our life is going to be forever, a great multitude that no one could number, from every tribe, from every nation, and peoples and languages. So for all the wrong terms taken by the Western Christians in the last 2,000 years, when you look at church growth globally today, it perhaps actually isn't stupid to imagine this vision coming true. Third, this is a bit complex. I'm going to quote a tweet by a chap called Glenn Scrivener, an Australian evangelist. He says, so this is talking about when people judge Christianity, right? When Christianity is judged by secular society, it is often assumed that the standards are universal to humanity, while the crimes are particular to Christians. He then says, it's usually the exact reverse. Our crimes, which are many as Christians, are everyone's, but the values by which we judge are Christian. Is it too late for that one? Maybe. So then he goes on to say, do you think Christianity is bigoted, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive or aggressive? If so, that's because you believe in equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom and progress. And where did those values come from? They are Christian. Final thing to say about diversity. Christianity, I think, is actually the only hope of sustaining this wonderful movement towards valuing diversity, which we've seen in the last generation, or few generations. Why? Because only Christianity provides a basis, this is kind of what Glenn Scrivener was saying, only Christianity provides a basis on which to value every person, regardless of disability, gender, religion, sexuality, ethnicity, age. Without God, who made all in his image, as we learned yesterday from Ben, and without God incarnate, who dignified human existence to an unimaginable level, it is simply down to, let's face it, in humanity, the strongest wins. If we don't have anything to base our inherent dignity on, well, eventually, the strongest will win. And that is where we'll slide to. These values are deeply Christian. There we go. There's some answers for diversity.